Well, the important thing is they've always kept this franchise realistic. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be ranking the 10 films of the Fast and Furious franchise as part of my franchise Rankography series. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. So what is a Rankography exactly? Well, it's my ranking of a filmography, whether that be a director's output, an actor's appearances, or even an entire franchise. My Rankographies are based on personal preference, and I rank movies according to how much I enjoyed them rather than any specific technical merit or attribute. Remember, this is just my ranking, not the ranking, so be sure to post your own personal ranking of the Fast and Furious franchise in the comments below. So I don't really believe in the idea of guilty pleasure movies, because I don't think anybody should feel guilty for enjoying a movie. But there are definitely films that I recognize are not cinematic greats. Movies that can't really hold up to much scrutiny under a traditional critical lens. The movies of the Fast and Furious franchise definitely fall into that category. And you know what? I don't care. I have a really good time with this franchise. It's definitely got its issues, and there are some films I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's also just a lot of big, dumb, ridiculous fun. There's just something about watching the absurd journey this group of characters have gone on over the last 2 decades, and I can't help but smile anytime I watch one of these movies. I've already reviewed all 10 of these movies on this channel, so if you want to check those out for some more in-depth thoughts on each of them, I'll put links in the description below. And also link some of them up in the cards as we go along. Alright, let's get this Rankography started. Coming in at number 10, The Fast and the Furious, Tokyo Drift. So this is definitely the black sheep of the Fast and Furious family. It's by far the biggest outlier from the rest of the franchise. The style, the drifting, the teen focus, the lack of main franchise characters. This movie has since been pulled back in and had its story worked into the main timeline of the franchise in a kind of clever way, but it definitely still sticks out. And I think that's a big part of what makes this arguably the most divisive film in the franchise. Not many people are gonna have it in the middle of their ranking. It's either gonna be at the very bottom or pretty close to the top. And now you know where it falls for me. Interestingly enough, this was actually the first Fast and Furious movie I ever saw. When I was a junior in college, me and my roommates used to have a fairly regular movie night as sort of an apartment bonding thing. One of my roommates was a really big car guy, so he chose this as our movie one week. And I can't say I was very impressed. Even a few years later, watching the entirety of the franchise in sequence, then only 4 movies, I still actively disliked this one. But even though it's still in last place on this list, I gotta say, over the years, it's certainly grown on me some. I don't get quite the same enjoyment out of it as the other movies, but I don't dislike it anymore. The teen-oriented style is still pretty lackluster for me, and I think most of the characters are iffy, but what this film does have going for it is Han. He's easily the best character in this film, and also, obviously, the way in which this film was eventually able to be tied into the rest of the franchise. Coming in at number 9, Fast and Furious. So this is the 4th film in the franchise, and I gotta admit, whenever I go a while between rewatches of this franchise and I look at my ranking, I'm always surprised by this placement. I think it's an error, because how could it be this low? We get the reunion of much of the family, and really our first continuation of the main storyline since the first movie. We get to see Han in his first chronological timeline appearance. We're introduced to Giselle. It starts off with the amazing and ridiculous gas heist, and we can't forget the insanity of the tunnels. So I always look at it so low in my ranking and think that I haven't updated this in a while or something. And so I watch it, and am quickly reminded of exactly why it's so low. The story of this one is just so dull. This is the one movie in the franchise that, despite having seen it a number of times, I never seem to be able to remember very much about. I remember the stunts, but the story? I don't know exactly what it is about this one, but it's remarkably forgettable for me. Maybe it's because the Letty stuff feels so melodramatic and convoluted. Maybe it's because the revenge storyline or the drug cartel angle feel overfamiliar and generic. The story is just very bland for me, but luckily, the family reunion and definitely the action helped to still make this a somewhat enjoyable movie for me. This film is sort of a fulcrum point in the franchise. It takes itself pretty seriously, but it's right on the precipice of going completely full-bore ridiculous with the action. So there's still some decent fun to be had with it, like watching Dom doing a wheelie in a Camaro with an F-bomb decal on the side. Coming in at number 8, Too Fast, Too Furious. I would say that after Tokyo Drift, this is probably the next most divisive film in the franchise. And I guess that's not too surprising, since they were both essentially spin-offs packaged as main franchise films. I know I've got this fairly low on the list, but I have to say I do really enjoy this movie. Probably a bit more than most other people. So yeah, it's in the 8 spot, but let's just say there's a decent gap between the 8 and 9 spots for me. But I understand people's complaints with this one. No Vin Diesel, the street racing scaled back from the first, though at this point that's an issue that's pretty moot. The story's not particularly meaningful, and Brian's the only thing that really connects it to the previous film. But for me, this movie is just a ton of fun. Some of the later franchise films get a bit silly, but so many of these movies, especially early on, are very self-serious. So there's something extra enjoyable about having a more light-hearted entry that knows how ridiculous these movies are and has fun with it. It's bright and colorful and campy and self-aware. It pokes fun at some of its own absurdity and has probably the most comedic tone of any of the main franchise films. There are a lot of jokes, but there's also a lot of very entertaining situational humor too. Plus, it introduces 2 characters, Roman and Tej, who have continued to inject the franchise with comedy and fun for almost another 2 decades. It's not the weightiest film, and it's got some pretty laughable CGI during the race scenes, but it's always just such a fun movie to watch. Coming in at number 7, The Fate of the Furious. I actually went back and forth for a while on my placement of this one. I decided to put it in the number 7 slot today, but this could have just as easily gone in the 5th or 6th spot for me. Out of all of the films in the franchise, 6, 8, and 9 are definitely the 3 closest for me. And I guess that kind of makes sense, because they do have some very similar elements. Obviously, all of the films are tied to one another, but Fast 6 started a multi-film story arc that really only became apparent as each new film was released. In this 8th installment, we've got plenty more of the techie, covert ops stuff that got started in 6, and we also see the return of some characters, as well as the expected ramp-up of action insanity. As always seems to be the case for this franchise, the action here is incredibly entertaining. Unbelievably ridiculous, but incredibly entertaining. We've got fiery races, zombie cars, bare-handed torpedo redirects, and even somebody getting kicked into a propeller. Most of the stunts were done practically, as usual for these films, but I can't help but be disappointed by the CG backgrounds, which really pull me out of some of these sequences and dampen my usual excitement about the action. The story here is decently solid. I like the idea of a rogue character, and I still think it had a lot of potential in this movie, but I think the execution left something to be desired. The film gave us, as the audience, way too much information from the start, and it was a major missed opportunity to craft a suspenseful and answer-seeking story. It took itself a bit too seriously, and although the film had a bit of an emotional momentum coming off of Furious 7, it takes it way too far, and ends up turning the family theme from one of its greatest assets into a big, sappy, melodramatic detriment. Coming in at number 6, F9. As I mentioned with the last film in the ranking, this one comes in really close with Fast 6 and Fate for me. Also, this is the only film in the franchise that I've only seen once, and with a critical eye preparing for a review. So I wouldn't be surprised if this one moves a little bit once I've had the opportunity to see it a few more times in a bit more relaxed of a context. But as it stands, this one is very much a middle-of-the-pack Fast and Furious movie for me. The story here, much like many of its immediate predecessors, is quite convoluted and overloaded with techie save-the-world stuff. Like Fate of the Furious, I think this one suffers from having too many villains, and even though I think John Cena works pretty well in the Fast and Furious universe, I do think he was a bit miscast in this particular role. Luckily, despite its story conveniences and messy script, or perhaps in part because of them, F9 delivers exactly what you would expect from a late stage installment of this franchise. Reality, logic, and feasibility went out the window a decade ago, so we're left with this incredibly stupid but ridiculously entertaining popcorn action blockbuster series that perpetually one-ups itself. And F9 one-ups Fate of the Furious. If you thought zombie cars and bare-handed torpedo redirects were ridiculous, just wait until you see the new heights the action gets launched to here. The action is as fun as ever, but perhaps most satisfying is the return to form we see for the family elements. There are some great cameos, reunions, and new additions that feel central to the plot without falling into the same overly sappy and melodramatic territory as its predecessor. Coming in at number 5, Fast and Furious 6. This movie had some big shoes to fill, coming immediately on the heels of Fast 5, and I think it managed to successfully fill one of the two shoes. Keeping with tradition in the franchise, this movie goes even bigger on just about every front. The side of that really works is the action. This is well into the throw logic out the window and just go as ridiculous as possible phase of the series' action. So it delivers on some very memorable and entertaining stunts. There are cars and tanks, people flying through the air, leaping headbutts, shootouts, chases, and a 26-mile-long runway. Everything is ramped up to absurd levels, and even though some of the stunts in the last film were pretty ridiculous, this is the movie where our characters seem to spawn some superhuman abilities. I think this film does a fairly good job with handling the family theme that's ever present in the franchise. The crew's together, there's some decent character development, and there are a number of pretty emotional sequences. One aspect related to the family side of things is a little convoluted, just as it was in its previous appearance back in the fourth film, but it's admittedly handled a little bit better this time around. So what about that second shoe I mentioned? The one that wasn't filled? Well, that empty shoe is entirely due to the plot. It's fun, and it's entertaining, but it's a big jump when compared to the stories of all the previous films. Our characters had always been kind of a ragtag group of criminals, street racing, stealing stuff. They did it in progressively more insane ways, but they were still reasonably believable characters. This film puts them up against Owen Shaw, who's effectively a supervillain, and so the group has to suddenly take on this techie covert ops thing to save the world. Like I said, it's fun, but a pretty big change in direction. Coming in at number 4, Hobbs and Shaw. So even though Too Fast, Too Furious and Tokyo Drift were spin-off films in spirit, Hobbs and Shaw is the only official spin-off, as of right now. And I went back and forth on whether or not to include it in the ranking, but I decided to include it because it is part of the franchise, even if it's not part of the central core storyline. And honestly, its inclusion doesn't really affect the order of anything else. That said, I'll admit it was a little tough to compare it to the main film, simply because of how over the top it is. I realize how dumb that sounds when we're talking about a franchise that's literally comprised of over-the-top films, but this one goes a few extra steps further that even the later main films have ever dared. This movie is so self-aware. It never quite goes to the point where it feels like it's parodying the franchise, but it continuously pokes fun at itself and the absurdity of everything that's happening. This one really plays up the superhero idea that the franchise has been flirting with since the 6th film, and straight up gives the characters a supervillain to deal with. I mean, I thought Owen Shaw was very supervillainy, but he's nothing compared to Brixton. The stunts here are insane, but as per usual, they're ridiculously fun to watch. And even though the story feels a little contrived at points and overemphasizes its attempts at sentimental moments a bit, this is an incredibly fun, enjoyable movie. Hobbs and Shaw exhibited some entertaining chemistry and banter in the 8th movie, and this film just runs with it, resulting in the most comedic film in the franchise, but also a really action-packed one too. Coming in at number 3, The Fast and the Furious. So we've got the one that started it all. It's kind of funny looking back on this one now, because I just know that absolutely nobody, not the cast, not the crew, not audiences sitting in that theater, would have guessed where this franchise would be 20 years later. And I doubt many expected this to even spawn a franchise, let alone one that would still be going strong after 2 decades. But the evolution that's occurred over these 20 years is even more surprising and unbelievable. This was just a little racing movie. It was basically a ripoff of Point Break and had a bunch of 20-something-year-olds hanging out, driving fast, and stealing DVD players. I mean, this is a movie where the biggest spectacle of an action set piece is a drag race and a solitary car crash. It might not seem like much now, and honestly, it's barely even recognizable as the same franchise, but I still think this is easily one of the most solid entries. Like I said, the story is basically Point Break, but that's a decent story. It's really easy to follow and refreshingly simple when compared to the craziness that would come later in the franchise. And this movie serves another important role. It establishes these characters. We get new additions with each new film, but the core four, Brian, Mia, Dom, and Letty, are integral to this family. And this movie did a surprisingly good job of setting these characters up and providing this sense of believability and realism to all of their relationships. Without that emotional family core, I don't think this franchise would have been successful. And to think, it all started with a tuna on white, no crust. Coming in at number 2, Furious 7. Of the later films in the franchise, this movie is a bit of an outlier, but in a good way. It's well into the second era of the franchise, so it's definitely a movie that's big and ridiculous. It's also right in the middle of the multi-film story arc that started with Fast 6, so there's a certain degree of complexity when it comes to the story and how it interweaves with the other movies. That could have posed a bit of a problem, because much like those other movies, this does have an excessively technological storyline. But amazingly, it manages to find the right balance with just about everything. With the story, the characters, the tone, the action, the emotion, just about everything here clicks into place in a way that hasn't quite been replicated since. The action here is absolutely unreal. While it doesn't have my all-time favorite franchise action sequence, I would say that overall, as a whole film, this is definitely the best the franchise's action has been. We've got the parachute sequence and the whole extended chase that follows, the tri-tower jump, the Ramsey keep-away sequence. On top of that, we've also got the best antagonist this franchise has ever offered, Deckard Shaw. And if all of that wasn't enough to cement this as one of the best installments in the franchise, it hits us with the strongest emotional core of any of the movies. This film certainly has a little something extra on that front since it was Paul Walker's final movie, but I do think the story and family themes here still would have been a highlight even without that added legacy. So that means my number 1 Fast and Furious movie is Fast 5. Who would have thought that the middle movie in a ridiculous action franchise would be the best? But man, this movie is basically an encapsulation of all of the things I like about this franchise. I consider this film to be the beginning of the second era of the franchise. It finally hit a point where the action and just general story couldn't be considered plausible anymore. And making that kind of jump was a huge risk, but it paid off so well. This film absolutely nails its tone. It doesn't have the silly irreverence that Hobbs and Shaw or even Too Fast, Too Furious have, but it also doesn't take itself too serious. It knows that it's ridiculous. It knows that it needs to be fun, but doesn't throw away a strong and somewhat meaningful story in the process. If the fourth film served as a reunion, this fifth one solidified the family dynamic by pulling in characters from every previous movie. We get the core characters from the original, Roman and Tej make their first appearance since the second movie, Hans pulled in from the third, Giselle from the fourth, so we get the benefit of the family. And then there's some entertaining campiness that comes from the intensity of Hobbs in his introduction to the franchise. This one also has easily my favorite plot in the franchise. It's a heist film, which is inherently a fun genre, so combining that with Fast and Furious in a one last job type of story was just a recipe for success and entertainment. And speaking of entertainment, the action here is so much fun. It actually still has some stunts that could pass for plausible, but it's when the laws of physics are finally thrown out the window that this film really shines, with my favorite sequence of the entire franchise, the vault chase. Alright, so that's my rankography of the Fast and Furious franchise. 10 movies, 1 family, and not a single law of physics in sight. What does your ranking look like? I'd love to see some reasoning for your order, so be sure to post it in the comments below. Remember, I've already reviewed all 10 of these movies, so you can check those videos out if you want some more in-depth discussion of each, as well as my ratings, pros and cons, and even tailored film recommendations. And if you're interested in buying any of these movies, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this rankography, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button, and if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or add it to see more videos like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.